Hello, welcome to this webinar. It's quite strange for me to talk to you without having you in front of me in a hall or a room, but COVID times unfortunately oblige us to take certain measures and to adopt unusual procedures with respect to our normal habits. So I will try to give you my best presentation possible about what we are doing regarding a debated topic, and that is the deep stops in recreational and or technical diving. With this presentation, I will try to show you what we are doing. You will see that there will be no precise take-home message. This will be an awareness presentation, just to make you know what we are doing, what are the results of our current research, and where we are going in order to give you some better information and some real take-home message, we hope as soon as possible, and mainly with your cooperation. Because bear in mind that the results that you will be seeing have been possible only with the active participation of the divers, of you divers, who participated in our citizen science field research programs that produced the results that I'm going to show you shortly. This is an outlook on the research we have been doing over the past years on deep stops, with the latest updates regarding what we did on technical diving especially. It all started a long time ago when in the late 90s, actually in the early 90s, we started seeing something that surprised us a bit. And that is that about 60% of the decompression illness cases that we monitored should not have happened. Where what we now define undeserved and implied no reasonable or evident mistake by the diver. Only 42% of the decompression illness cases implied mistakes, and so, which means not respecting of decompression tables, errors in ascent, or similar. And so they might have been defined as deserved. This has been for the first time published with big evidence back in 2017 when we reported about 40,000 recreational dives that we could fully monitor with electronic dive profile, bubble count, behavioral questionnaires, and so forth. One of the main results of that study, of studying 40,000 dives, as I said, was looking at the comparison between the production of circulating bubbles, venous gas emboli, VGE as we call them, as compared to the gradient factor at the end of the dive, the so-called gradient factor high, which is an index of inner gas supersaturation achieved by tissues by the time of surfacing. If you look at this plot, you will see that there is a curve that steeps up and grows when a certain number on the horizontal axis is overcome. That number is, as you can see, 2. I show it with my cursor here. What is this 2? This is the level of bubbles that we can record by precordial Doppler and or by echocardiography. And you will see that whenever the 80% of the maximum allowed supersaturation in tissues is superated, here you see 0.8 means 80%, the number of bubbles increases dramatically up to levels of 4. 4 bubble level means bubbles that overcome and superate the noise itself of the heart. Whereas bubble counts lower than 2 means occasional bubbles every now and then over the 1 minute observation, listening to the heart cycles. What is this? This is a way to express one of the values that the decompression tables are calculated upon. That is the maximum allowed supersaturation of the leading compartment. This is something that we had already seen back in 1993, because we saw that the majority of cases of decompression illness and high bubbling was actually related to dives that had a supersaturation of the leading tissue, that is the most saturated tissue in the group that we were considered, over 80%. The analysis of 40,000 dives simply confirmed that. So whenever this gradient factor, this level of supersaturation is superated, the divers tend to bubble significantly. This was published, as I said, and this is a so-called box plot showing this difference and comparing the supersaturation at the end of the dive in cases that implied decompression illness, here above the blue plot, and below the supersaturation achieved by the cases who did not imply decompression illness, the black plot below. You may wonder what quartiles are. Now, I think you're all familiar with the Gauss curve, the Gauss bell, so-called. The Gauss bell is made of 4 parts, essentially. The so-called outliers, either the most and less susceptibles on the 2 ends of the bell, and the median part, the larger part of the population at the peak of the bell. You can divide this ideal bell in 4 parts, accounting for 25% each, and this part is a quartile. This box plot are simply a linear presentation of a Gauss bell. So you will see the outliers, the exceptional, the unusual ones, here on the left and here on the right, here and here, and the larger proportion of people concentrating in the middle 50%. This middle line here is what we call the median. The median is not the average. If you make an average between 0.49 and 1.15, you won't have 0.79, you will have a different figure. The median is actually the median value of the 2 center quartiles. So, in this case, the people who incurred in decompression illness out of 40,000 recorded dives and 327 decompression illness cases had a supersaturation of 0.79. You remember what I showed you before about the high bubble peaking, the high bubbles occurring when supersaturation is over 0.8? Here we are. On the contrary, the ones who did not incur in decompression illness had shown a median value, as you can see, of 67, which means less than 70% of the maximum allowed supersaturation at the end of the dive. Now, what is strange about this? the strangest thing is that either the table and the current majority of computers tell you that you can surface if your allowed supersaturation is 99. Because this is the origin of the tables before bubbles started to be monitored. Actually, the precursor, the heralds of this were the Canadians of DCIM, the Canadian Defense Institute, with Professor Nishi, who actually devised decompression tables based on bubble production. And strange or not, these tables are very compatible with the results that we are now seeing in terms of reduction of bubbling and therefore reduction of decompression illness occurrence. So the message from this slide is that you can incur in a decompression illness even much before reaching the maximum allowed supersaturation that your computer or your table tell you that you can stand. So, based on this, what are we doing in order to give you more precise information and possibly some predictive modalities that will allow you to dive and surface with less risk and less unpredictable risk especially? One of the things that divers tend to do in order to reduce this decompression illness chance, so to speak, and to reduce the supersaturation of tissues on surfacing is introducing deep stops in their dive profile. This has been done by large empirically by the divers, even if some researchers produced a number of algorithms that are based on this concept. It may seem funny that actually the first one who ever produced such an algorithm was the very inventor of the current decompression tables, and that is John Scott Haldane, who actually recommended halving the depth or the pressure, the environment pressure, the absolute pressure, in order to reduce the bubbling and the decompression stress. But nevertheless, he was not so listened after a while, and tables went another way. Now the question is, unless you follow a well-designed study, is it advisable for you to insert additional stops irrespective of what your computer tells you or the tables that you are following tell you to do? And the answer is no. You should not introduce any stop arbitrarily unless you really know what you're doing or you are following a precisely set up algorithm, that is, following something that has been studied and tested on a sufficient number of for a sufficient number of times. Do we have algorithms that include deep stops or call them some stops different from the classical Haldanian tables on the market? Yes, we do. There are many. One that is not shown on this slide is the famous Bruce Vinkey's RGBM, reduced gradient bubble model, that allows you to actually include some deep stops, and depending on what you include in your dive profile will calculate accordingly, and I would say reliably enough. After Haldane, the precursor of the deep stop theory was Pyle, who actually designed tables based on actually a biological observation. He as an ichthyologist, was studying fishes and was seeing that in order to take fishes up alive and put them in his aquarium, the divers needed to decompress their bladder. And more or less, they decompressed their bladder at the mid of the ascent profile. Now, the funny thing is that the divers who decompressed fishes also suffered far less decompression illness than the divers who ascended without decompression fishes. And so this is the real origin of the pile model, which obviously was then elaborated mathematically into a real algorithm. So you have, yes, we have models that can guide you to deep stops. Then there is the half depth model, which is, after all, nothing else than the Haldanian model, and a variation of the half depth, which is the half ambient pressure, half absolute pressure, which normally differs from half depth by a ratio of 5 meters, more or less. Not more or less, 5 meters actually, that's mathematics. So yes, we do have some models to follow. We started to apply this theory in a relatively innovative way back in the 90s, in the early 90s, with the so-called Marr-Ben study. Marr-Ben stands for Marroni and Bennett. I had the honor to do this study together with Professor Peter Bennett. The result of this study, which has been published on the Undersea Hyperbaric Medicine Journal, is what you can read on the left of this slide. The introduction of a deep stop during the compression ascents appears to significantly decrease Doppler recorded bubbles and predicted gas tensions in the fast tissues, which may relate to actual gas exchange within the spinal cord. What did we study? Normal recreational dives between 18 and 40 meters depth with either minimum deco or no mandatory deco. And we studied a deep stop at about half the depth of the dive. We did that over 500 dives performed by a number of individuals. This has been published in 2004, and this is the title of the paper that you can still find easily on the web. The main results of that study were the following. Dives without any stop produced very high bubble levels. Dives with a safety stop, the recommended normal safety stop, produced less bubbles. Dives with the deep stop plus the safety stop produced significantly less or virtually no bubble at the end of the dive. This complex table shows you the profiles that we compared. As you can see, there are 3 profiles with deep stop, 15 plus 6, 15 plus 6, 15 plus 6. The dives were at 30 meters, the study dives. The 3 profiles were differentiated by the speed of ascent. So we did 3 profiles with 3 meters per minute speed of ascent, 3 profiles with 10 meters per minute, and 2 profiles with 18 meters per minute, because we didn't want to have divers ascending at 18 meters per minute without any safety stop. We considered it too dangerous at that time. Now you will see that the bubble grades were very low when we had the deep stop. And the lowest value, 179 average, in the expanded Spencer scale, which is the method we used to measure bubbles, and in the classical Spencer scale, which is the reference model we used, are the lowest here. 10 meters per minute speed of ascent, deep stop with an average surfacing saturation of the highest, the fastest tissue of 25%, average surface saturation of the 10 minutes tissue, medium tissue, 52 as opposed to 100, which is the maximum allowed, and a bubble score ranging between, let's say, 2 and 2.5, as opposed to bubble scores quite higher when the deep stop was not used, as you can see in the other boxes of this plot. So this study actually confirmed to us that in that kind of recreational diving, the introduction of a deep stop coupled with a speed of ascent of 10 meters per minute max was the safest way to ascend with respect to bubble production. The two greenish lines are the ones that produced the best results. There is also a difference in the safety of speed of ascent. It is not always true that a very slow speed of ascent is safer. As you can see, a very slow speed of ascent, 3 meters per minute, was the one that produced actually more bubbles than the others. As far as compared safety, 10 and 18 meters per minute are more or less the same, but adding the deep stop, the 10 meter per minute speed of ascent actually produced much less bubbles than any other ascent profile. Over that study and after that study, we introduced a model and an algorithm which I called the proportional M-value reduction concept. In other words, the fastest the tissue, the difference is the percent reduction of the M-value that we imposed based on the kind of dive that we were considering at that time. This was studied on a sample of 14 volunteers during 20 dry tests in a chamber involving 210 dives and monitored with 388 precordial Doppler readings. This model is not yet public, although we use it to do the back analysis of the decompression risk, what we call the decompression risk analysis that we use to study and to evaluate the inherent risk of any dive profile. This is the result of applying this model and comparing it to a very standard Bullman algorithm, the one that you may find in most current decompression tables and in most current decompression computers on the market. Using the Bullman model, with those simulated dives in the chamber, we had 16.5% divers with 0 bubbles, 58% divers with low-grade bubbles, 25% divers with high bubble grades, and only 0.5% divers with a lot of bubbles, what we called high bubble grade plus, as opposed to 60, actually almost 61% 0 bubbles when we adopted the experimental model PMRC, 39.2% low bubble grades, 0 high bubble grades, 0 high bubble grades plus, which means that by using the PMRC approach to ascent from a recreational dive profile, we could actually zero the occurrence of very high bubble grades. and the maximum, the majority of the dives was actually bubble-free. We confirmed this study and these results by not only precordial bubble recording, but also by echocardiography bubble recording. And we applied the same method to technical diving. Retrospectively, we analyzed a number of technical dives recently. This was done 2 years ago at the Y40 pool in Padua. And when applying the same comparison between the decompression illness cases and the non-decompression illness cases after technical diving, we saw that technical divers, as compared to recreational divers, tend to do slightly higher risk dives. So it's not surprising that their average supersaturation on ascent is slightly higher than the one you can find in normal recreational divers. You may remember that in the box plot of normal recreational divers, we found 0.79 as the medium supersaturation of gas on ascent. In the technical diving community, this gradient, this supersaturation is slightly higher, and we have a 0.88 gradient factor high on ascent. Whereas the maximum achieved supersaturation in both groups is very similar. Not surprising that the technical divers may achieve a higher supersaturation due to the fact that they tend to do slightly more aggressive dives. Definitely they do deco dives as opposed to the vast majority of divers, or recreational divers who do not decompression dives. But it is still very surprising that we have decompression illness both in recreational diving and in technical diving with gradient factors at surfacing which are absolutely normal according to the allowed limits or to the recommended limits by the current dive computers or dive tables, because these limits are well within the permitted supersaturation, which is considered safe by the current reference referral computers or tables. So we needed to study a bit more and replicate what we had done with the original Marben study, and which ended up in the PMRC model. And we compared two very similar decompression procedures with a group of technical divers at the Y40 pool in Padua. This was done by pre-setting the gradient factor. The first study that I mentioned was done by analyzing the free behavior of divers, and we derived and calculated the gradient factor afterwards. In this case, we were dealing with a community of highly experienced technical divers, and so we compared two different settings of gradient factors, also according to what is a very common habit of the technical diving community, that is, that the diver himself or herself sets the preferred gradient factors, both low and high, according to what he or she expects to happen or accepts to incur in when considering the risk, the decompression risk. I think I don't need to remind you that a gradient factor setting is simply the adjustment of exposure limits by expressing them as a fraction of the maximum allowed limit for that particular tissue for that particular compartment. This is an example of how you can change your ascent profile by different settings in a gradient factor low and high. For example, in blue you have a gradient factor of 1090, in red a gradient factor of 2070, and so on and so forth. So with this gradient factor, GF 1090, you will have a deep stop, a very deep stop, a deep stop, because you will stop when you reach 10% of the maximum allowed supersaturation, virtually almost immediately or very shortly after leaving the bottom. If you have a 90%, if you have a 70% higher gradient factor, it means that you will only ascend when you are at 70% of the maximum allowed supersaturation. It means that you will have to wait some time before you leave the surface. You will have to desaturate before you hit the surface. Whereas if you accept to ascend when you are 100% supersaturated as compared to the maximum allowed value, you will obviously ascend and surface earlier than if adopting a lower gradient factor high. This is another example of how you can have a shallow first stop if you accept, here we are, if you accept a gradient factor low of 100%, which means that you will be allowed time to ascend from your bottom depth until you reach a supersaturation in the first tissue that reaches the higher level equal to 100%. It's a complex matter, and this is also why we do not recommend to any diver to do this without really knowing what gradient factors are, having studied Baker's book on gradient factors and so on, really understanding what you're playing with, because you may hurt yourself if you don't know exactly what you do playing with this number. Just bear in mind that the lower the gradient factor low is, the deeper you will stop, first stop. The higher the gradient factor low is, the shallower will be your first stop, close to the surface. The lower your gradient factor high is, the longer time you will stay in the water. And the higher your gradient factor high is, the shorter time you will stay in the water, which means either low or high risk, or in terms of gradient factor high, either high or low risk. So this is what we are playing around, and this is what we based our research on with a group of technical divers. These were the two profiles that we compared. The so-called shallow stop profile. As you can see, the depth is the maximum of the Y40 pool, 42 meters. We had a bottom time equal for both dives and a total running time equal for both dives. 40 minutes bottom time, 77 minutes run time. The deco parameters for the shallow stop profile were 5 minutes at 9 meters, 26 minutes at 6 meters, and 3 minutes at 3 meters. This means that at this depth, there was a change of breathing mix going to 50-50 enriched air nitrox. The deep stop profile was, as shown in the slide, 40 minutes at 21 meters, 3 minutes at 18, 3 minutes at 15, 3 minutes at 12, 4 minutes at 9, 12 minutes at 6, and 6 minutes at 3 meters. We studied 18 subjects, 17 males, 1 female, who performed 36 dives, and they were all experienced GOE technical divers. In this table you will see the number of values, the height, the weight, the anthropometric data of the participants. There were no differences, no significant differences between the dives as concerning maximum depth. Obviously, the pool is the same. As concerning running time, we paid attention to have the same running time and the same bottom time. And even if there was a slight difference, this was not significant when concerning the surface gradient factor for both shallow stop and deep stop dives. Surface gradient factor is actually the gradient factor not at the end of the last deco stop, but when you hit the surface. And we have, you have a method, we have a method to actually calculate that as well, because that is actually where you hit the risk hard. I mean, this is when you hit the atmosphere and you actually come out of the water and confront yourself with 1 ATA environment pressure that you have the real problem. There were differences, significant differences for both profiles in terms of physiological effects. Both profiles implied a cellular effect on the red blood cells, which were actually reduced after the dives, on both kind of dives, and on hemoglobin as measured by pinprick according to our diving safety lab modality. So the dives per se, either with or without a deep stop, produced some significant effects on the blood, but did not produce any significant difference on hydration. The dehydration or the hydration status of the divers was the same after the 2 dives, both with and without deep stops. Where we found a significant difference between the 2 profiles is with bubbles. And these were bubbles not measured acoustically, but visualized, the photographed with cardioechography after the dive. We performed echography immediately after the dive, 15 minutes after, and then at 15 minutes interval for a relatively long time after the dive. And here you can see the difference in bubbling in divers who followed the shallow stop profile, what we call the Bullman profile, and the deep stop profile. As you can see, the bubble grade is significantly different between the Bullman model, no deep stop, and the deep stop profile that I showed you there before, with bubble grades which never reached level 2 in the deep stop group, and were always above level 2 up until almost 1 hour after the dive with the Bullman shallow stop profile. Plotting it, this is the result. and the difference of the two graphs, of the two columns, is definitely significant, whereby the shallow stop produces significantly more bubbles of higher bubble grade than the deep stop profile. We also adopted a new predictive model, which is quite innovative, that we are now studying with a group of Brazilian colleagues, that tries to anticipate the bubble production by different parameters that can be recorded directly on the diver while diving, so before he even starts the ascent, and during the ascent. On the left, there is the estimated bubble count adopting this new novel parameter with the deep stop, with the shallow stop profile. The estimated production of bubble is very similar to that high peak, immediate high level production at surfacing that you have seen in the previous plots. And the estimated number of bubbles of the shallow stop profile was 600 bubbles per frame in the echocardiogram, whereas the production of bubbles with the deep stop profile resembled the curve that we observed really, and the estimated number of bubbles was 440, which also is compatible with what we observed on the echocardiography frames. This is something that promises to be a very interesting tool that will hopefully allow us to better predict decompression stress in the near future. Just to show you what bubbles are, look at this. This is the image of the heart that we monitor after the dives through echocardiography. This is a so-called four-chamber image. This is the right ventricle. This is the left ventricle. These white dots, here it's almost a curtain of white dots, are the bubbles, as you can see them passing with the blood flow through the heart. This is a real echocardiogram taken after a shallow stop dive. As you can see, the left ventricle is full of bubbles, the right ventricle is full of bubbles, and many bubbles pass on the left ventricle, which means that they can go in the arterial circulation. This is a slightly worse image in terms of four-chamber image, but as you can see, there is virtually no bubble in the right ventricle and only occasional signals passing on the left ventricle, which means that the deep stop did not actually produce any significant bubble in this group of technical diving, doing a technical dive, even if not at a very deep dive, a very deep depth, only 42 meters. But the dive was long, 40 minutes, and the runtime was long, 77 minutes. We repeated the study in the UK in a quarry recently. The dive was a bit more provocative, 50 meters for 25 minutes, runtime 60 minutes, and we were using not open circuit but rebreather at that time. We compared gradient factor setting 2085 versus 5075. We had 7 divers doing 14 dives. The bubble grades were more or less similar without a really significant difference. But the production of bubbles, what we call the bubble wave, was definitely different. And the more conservative gradient factor setting apparently more conservative gradient factor setting produced a different wave of bubbles. I have actually some problems in defining which of these two is more or less conservative, because this is more conservative in terms of deep stop, but slightly less conservative in terms of gradient factor high, that is surfacing. This one is definitely more conservative as far as surfacing, but slightly less conservative as far as the first deep stop. And here we would enter into an endless discussion on which compartments you load or wash out by changing gradient factors. But I will not go into deeper details about this. Just see that the bubble wave is definitely different. With a lower gradient factor low, you produce bubbles not immediately, but you have a peak of bubbles around 45 minutes after the dive. With a different gradient factor, 50, 75, you produce bubble a bit faster within the first 30 minutes, but then they wean out and they wash out slightly better. And you end up with less bubbles at 1.5 hours after the dive, and even 1 hour after the dive, and 75 minutes after the dive. So you seem to produce a little bit more bubbles immediately, but then to wash them out more efficiently over time. This may be a result of keeping the gradient factor high lower than in the first profile. This second run of tests did not provide clear results as the one at Y40, but it's definitely intriguing, and we are now trying to understand in better detail what the bubble wave means. But if we consider that bubbles are pro-inflammatory factors, the more you keep them into your circulation, the worse. The faster you wash them out, probably the best. So even here, keeping a gradient factor high lower could result into being more protective than keeping it higher as in this profile. So this is what we are doing now, as I was anticipating. And now we are continuing with comparing these dives with groups of technical divers until we will have not only interesting results, but sufficient numbers. We could tell you something about normal recreational diving after having analyzed 40,000 dives. And now we almost have reached 100,000 dives in our database. So we have numbers to reason on and to talk to you about. With the technical diving community, we are barely reaching a few hundreds now, and they are not enough yet. We will need your participation. We will need to keep on working with the technical diving community to collect data, to compare data, and to keep on doing our research, which actually focuses at defining the risk factors as compared to the habits of the recreational diving community, so to identify the best possible behavior, not only the best ascent, but the best dive profile possible that would allow all of us to enjoy our dives while keeping them as safe as possible. We are also doing that with your cooperation by comparing what you actually do. For example, to see whether by recording your dives and sending them to our database, you are actually doing what we all recommend. Plan the dive and dive the plan. Are we sure that after planning the dive, you are diving the plan or we are diving the plan? Memory is fallacious. Memory tricks us. So we have to record data and to compare data by actually looking at the real electronic dye profile we did as compared to what we had planned to do. And this will provide us with invaluable tools to improve our diving skills, to improve our briefings and debriefings, to improve our knowledge and awareness about safety of diving. So be ready to participate in this dedicated survey for technical diving that we are launching and that you will soon be more informed about, so that we can produce a second paper like this one that you are seeing on the right end of the slide, which was referred to normal recreational diving, and we now intend to produce a second paper which will be focused on the technical diving community in order to answer to the need of clarity and safety that the entire recreational diving community is looking for. Thank you very much. Any question you can address to the email address that you see there. Feel free to write to us, ask whatever you want. We will do our best to answer in the shortest time possible. Thanks again. Enjoy your dives.